In this video, we're going to talk about whether or not to include a strictly commercial property on a residential 1003 application. And I'm not going to cover every agency, but I am going to discuss how Fannie Mae handles it. To the best of my knowledge, there is no agency that has clear-cut guidelines on this topic. So by covering how Fannie Mae looks at it, I hope to give you a framework to think about it if this topic comes up and your applicant owns and has a mortgage on a strictly commercial property that is not the subject property when they're getting a residential mortgage. So if we open up the Fannie Mae selling guide and we search for the word commercial, we'll see that that comes up 61 times. You'll see references to Universal Commercial Code, that Fannie doesn't secure a mortgage on a property that is for commercial purposes, commercially reasonable determinations coming into play a couple of times. And then we will come to two places where they do discuss commercial properties in regard to strictly residential transactions. And here's the first one, that the commercial property mortgage is not to be counted in the maximum total number finance properties that Fannie allows. And then the next one that's applicable is that Fannie does say that if there is rental income from a commercial property owned by the borrower, that using that income as qualifying income is acceptable. And most of the rest of the references to commercial property pretty soon we'll be getting into the limits on commercial space in a condo or co-op property. So there are just those two references in the Fannie Mae guide to commercial property. So the question comes up, what if the applicant has a mortgage on a commercial property and it appears on their credit report? So most folks will say if it's on the credit report, then it needs to be dealt with at least from a verification of mortgage basis. And even though the borrower may be on a program that's W-2 only that doesn't require tax returns, once the underwriter sees that commercial mortgage, they may be interested in getting a fuller accounting via tax returns or leases if it's a newer property, to make sure that the customer is not hemorrhaging money on this property. So now the question becomes, what if the property does not appear on the credit report? And most underwriters will say if it's not on the credit report and the borrower doesn't have to provide tax returns, therefore the income or loss on that property won't be on the tax returns, that they're open to overlooking that property. A lot of times the loan officer doesn't alert the underwriter that the borrower owns this property. And I feel that that is making a mistake. It's putting you and the company that you work for at risk for not fully disclosing all the information about the borrower. The information should be disclosed, and it should be the underwriter's final call as to whether or not they are going to require the analysis of that commercial property. So I'm going to shift over here to our program, the Complete 1003 Interactive Training Program. And when the student comes down, your newer MLO or loan officer assistant or processor comes down to the credit section, let's say that they have, the applicant is asked, do you have any debts that are not listed on the standard 1003 application, excluding month-to-month obligations? To also make sure you include any debts that the applicant is going to be obligated on through the time of the closing. And to list an applicant's spouse debts if the spouse isn't applying for the mortgage, but they live in a community property state or are influenced by a community property state. And so now, after asking the question, we come down and we start discussing the guidelines around credit. And I'm going to focus on this one right here. So notifying the student that the customer should have included all the credit items listed on their 1003 application, but sometimes consumers forget to include those debts if they're not included on their credit report. And so to help them amend their 1003, if it's helped them remember other obligations. And also that items that appear on bank statements as steady checks and debits that might not appear on a credit report still may need to be added to the debt to income ratio. So if the underwriter is looking at the bank statements and they see a steady amount of a check of hundreds of dollars going out every month, and an example of that would be a parent who's co-signed for their child's dorm or college apartment and is making those payments for the child, those payments very likely will need to be considered as a debt. And then here we get into the discussion about the commercial property, so that in many cases the underwriters have discretion on commercial properties, especially when the applicant is signed personally. It's on the credit report, it's likely you have to account for it, or if tax returns are provided as part of the application process. And then pointing out that, if the applicant needs to use the income to qualify, of course, you'll need to get a credit history on the mortgage if it's not on the credit report. And if it's not on the credit report and you don't need tax returns, it's still best to ask your underwriter for guidance. And if the underwriter then says, okay, we're not going to consider it, you can keep it off the 1003, we'll let the loan go through without considering that, then you can make a note in the file so that if there's ever an issue later on, you're protected and your company's protected. You've disclosed that you knew that the borrower did have a commercial property with a commercial mortgage, and you requested how to handle it, and you did it in accordance with what the underwriter suggested.